All right. Well, it's 1:08, so I think I'll go ahead and get our meeting kicked off here. Um, so this is hello everybody. First of all,
Don't
good to see
forget
you
to
all
press
again.
the
It's been a
record
while.
button. Don't forget to press the record button.
Oh, okay. You know what? I think these get automatically recorded through our public input.
All I see up here is that it was connected and it's live, but I can't really tell if it's recording.
All right. Yeah. Well, just in case, it's good to have a
There we
backup.
go. That's what I was looking for.
Yeah.
So this is meeting number 6 of our scoping group, and like I said, we took a little bit of a break, and it's been a while since we met. I hope everyone is doing well. We are live streaming this meeting as usual through the publicinput.com site, which can be accessed through the project website at www.frederickcountymd.gov /8141. And as per usual, prior to the end of the meeting, we'll stop to take public comment if there are any callers. Also, the kind of the same, everyone seems to be doing it, to keep yourself muted unless you need to say something. And, there's no parliamentary procedure, just, turn off and wave your hand or whatever. Just jump right in if you have anything to contribute. So today on the agenda, we're going to have another case study presented by Dennis Suprazinski on our planning staff, and he's going to talk about the Rockville Town Center. And this will be the final case study that we'll be presenting to this group. But before we get into that, I want to give the group kind of an idea of where we're going from here, and to kind of put into a bit of context what we want to get from these case studies and how we want to be able to apply some of that knowledge to the South Frederick corridors. So I think I mentioned in the previous email that we were going to think about conceptual design issues for this area. But in all honesty, the exact manner of doing that has been somewhat ambiguous in my mind, which might be the same for you guys. And that's partly because we're planning on holding a community design visioning workshop, or kind of a design charrette, as it could be called. And to explain that, kind of this idea of a charrette a little bit, I'm going to just jump into a little bit of history. So this word charrette kind of is a French word for cart, if you guys aren't familiar. In the context of planning and design, it was used in the 19th century. This is kind of where it originated, in the Beaux Arts School of Architecture and Planning in Paris. And what would happen is, basically at the end of the term, there would be teams of students, architects, that would kind of work right up to the end of their deadline. And then a cart would be kind of wheeled around, and they would put their projects, in this cart. And this was used in the 19th century at the Beaux Arts School. So, like I mentioned, and this always was entailed by like a period of really intensive work and this kind of feverish process of adding kind of finishing touches to their projects, and it became known as referred to as working on charrette, or en charrette. I guess is how they would have said it, or in the cart. I guess it literally means. So nowadays, from this origin, this charrette idea has really come to refer more to an effort that's primarily about collaborating on design. And it does this by kind of sharing ideas and generating ideas, and it does it over kind of a short but intense period of time. So since the South Frederick Corridors is a plan that's very kind of heavy on urban design issues and potential, we wanted to use this design-based charrette process as a means of collaboration and public involvement. But frankly, in my mind, it's not totally clear to us how this should work just yet. And so, to get a little help with this process, we have hired a consultant. The firm is called Renaissance Planning, and this is the same firm actually that has helped us with the Livable Frederick Master Plan, kind of helped shape the development of that plan. And they've been kind of contracted to help us figure out how we can do this process as we move forward. And there are a number of kind of significant issues related to doing this, especially in the context of COVID and virtual participation, which adds kind of a whole other level of complication. But also in the context of trying to involve citizens that may not have significant experience like in a design process, kind of beyond the scoping group or even within the scoping group. So as we've pointed out in one of our earlier meetings, people who aren't necessarily trained or tuned in to the design process are often kind of more effective when they play the role of a critic and kind of react to designs that have been done. And this is actually even more vital because sometimes people who are working on designs, they need to kind of detach from what they're doing in order to evaluate, and that's often kind of difficult. People get attached to what they're kind of creating. So what all this boils down to is the central role we hope that this scoping group will play in this upcoming charrette process. And therefore, it seems to make sense for this group to kind of concentrate an exploration of design and design potential in the context of the charrette. Um, so that's basically a way of saying that we're really looking at this charrette as being this singular effort to really explore a lot of these design issues related to the plan. But with that being said, when Dennis finishes his presentation on the Rockville Town Center, if we have time, I'd like to reflect a little bit on the case studies that we've seen so far. So to recap, we've looked at the parole plan outside of Annapolis. We've looked at the Columbia Town Center, the Meriden Green Project in Connecticut, and the Mosaic Project in Fairfax, Virginia. And today we'll be looking at the Rockville Town Center. And afterwards, I'd like us to discuss whether we think kind of similar approaches are possible in the corridors. And if so, kind of when and where. For example, is something possible in a certain location, but not for a long period of time? Or is it something that could happen tomorrow? And would there be a different version of the same approach that could work a little bit better, something more intense or less intense? And then ultimately, kind of what would not work and why wouldn't it work? So I guess before we start any of that kind of discussion, kind of this evaluation of the case studies that we've seen, which maybe you guys can have in the back of your mind as we're watching Dennis's presentation, and help us kind of discuss and think about a little bit about how these case studies might relate to the South Frederick corridors. Um, uh, before we kind of get into that, I wanted to just ask the group if there are any other questions or any other issues that have come up, any concerns that you'd like to bring up and discuss before we get into the presentation from Dennis. So, anyone? Mark, I see you.
Yes. So to make sure I understand, by the time you get to the charrettes process, are you going to have some visible on paper or on the screen conceptual designs of at least some sections of the South corridors?
We're going to work through that with the consultant, but my current feeling is that, and what I think makes sense right now, although future information may modify that, is that there may be two sort of general groups that may be composed of subgroups. And one of those groups may focus more on actual physical design, and the other group may focus more on critiquing the output of the first group, and then kind of having this back and forth. A critique will be given, the design group will go back, incorporate those critiques, go back again, and sort of do this iterative thing.
And so what role do we as the scoping group have in this? In that process?
Well, I mean, I think you could play a role in either one of those, whichever one you, I mean, of course, this is not fully determined yet. This is sort of my speculation, but like within that speculation, you know, if there are these two groups, then scoping members could participate in either one of those groups, and they could offer the experience of having had discussions with the scoping group, having had exposure to the case studies, introducing all of their professional and life experience into the process. So, you know, like you could play a role in the design part, you could play a role in the critique part. I think it makes sense to try to keep the scoping group somewhat cohesive throughout this, so that as this plan moves forward, as we come with more iterations, the group can still play a role in evaluating what's being produced as it's being produced down the line. So even as we're going through the planning commission process, it would be great to have the group be able to sort of evaluate those plans as they move forward and offer input and comment to the planning commission.
Okay, and one final thing then to follow up. I'm wondering if there's some merit if we have more of a more precise conceptual design for us as the scoping group to critique before it gets to that more wider public audience. I know for me personally, and I'm somewhat attuned to this stuff, I've been struggling with how to envision what this is going to, the end product is going to look like here. And I'm just envisioning once this gets to the wider public, you know, we've had months to discuss this, and you know, the general public's going to dive into this without the background, without the all the information that we've had before us, and it looks very messy to me, quite frankly.
Yeah, I could definitely see how it could get very messy. I guess I hope the scoping group could play a role in sort of being mentors for other people that are involved, you know, based on your experience with this group so far, and helping to guide sort of what's being done and injecting some of the information that you've gotten. It might be helpful, you know, even prior to that, to basically generate a concept plan for the entire corridor and present it to you guys and get your feedback. The reason why, I know I've mentioned that several times, and you know, we're kind of prepared to be able to do that, but the relationship of that to what they do in the scoping group or in the charrette has created some ambiguity in my mind about what the appropriate course should be. You know, like would it be redundant almost to present something here ahead of time and then kind of duplicate that when we move to the scoping group?
So I just have a kind of a feedback comment on it. I had participated in your Liverpool Frederick public meetings, and I think what was useful when you did those presentations is that you provided concepts that we could do. Okay, what would transportation look like? What would, and it allowed us to kind of focus our mindset to what we were seeking feedback on. And I think something along that line to help guide the conversation with the public would be perhaps useful and meaningful, and it wouldn't be kind of like all over the map, because I think that's the last thing we want to really go ahead and do. Because in the end, with the end product, we need to produce a report that we're going to give to the council representative, and that vision needs to be spelled out into some way they can say, yeah, that makes sense, or I see your thought process. That's a very good strategy for how we can tackle this. And and getting the public input as part of that iterative process, I think would be helpful. I do not know what your process is for when you're going to start writing up some of these report or start drafting so that you can kind of start putting pieces in place. I don't know if you intend to do that while we're doing the charrette, or it made more sense to go ahead and do it after we do the charrette process to start kind of getting some foundational pieces in place.
I can guarantee, at least from my point of view, that as we enter into the public part of this plan, we won't be coming with a big empty slate. Livable Frederick was a little bit different because we were building a vision from the ground up. In this particular plan, I think there's a lot of momentum behind a couple of big ideas here. And so I think that by the time we get to public, full public input, it's going to be a very different kind of public, given the activities that are generally happening out in these corridors now, and number two, as I would say, or B, by the time we get there, we will have already had the basis for this plan being established in the Livable Frederick master planning document. I mean, this is going to be, I think, a very different approach. We're not going to come to people with a blank piece of paper. Because that's not what's happening in this particular planning effort. So in terms of the messiness, I think we'll still have some messiness because it's our first, it's our first kind of urban design oriented plan. So there's going to be some messiness there. But in terms of trying to keep people on track and trying to help people understand what it is we're doing, it's a Herculean task, but I think John is up to it. So I'm not at all shaken by that.
It's because I'm Greek.
Yes.
Hey, this is Jamie from MTA. We face similar issues sometimes when we're developing some of our long-range plans and have a lot of ideas that we can share of how to present this in a way that's interactive but still understandable for the public. We've done a lot of human-centered design and engagement around, speaking the same language as the folks that we need to reach. If you think that would be helpful in any way, because we often face that same, like, this is nebulous and we know what we want to get to, but we don't know how to get there situation. So happy to share whatever resources we have available.
We're meeting with our consultant tomorrow afternoon. Sorry.
Well, tell them to stop calling you during this meeting. Good grief.
That's probably like CVS robocall for my prescription being ready. That's all we ever get on my landline.
Or your car warranty has expired and half of us are like, we don't have cars.
Yeah, that's the other half. I don't know if maybe you'd be interested in participating in that meeting with our consultant tomorrow. Maybe offer some input about how you guys have done it.
If you think it would be helpful, go ahead and send me the invite. I will tell you, I have 6 meetings scheduled at 1 o'clock that I'm going to not make. So hopefully it's not at 1 o'clock.
I think it's at 2 o'clock, but
there's hope yet.
Yeah.
At 2 o'clock, there's a city and county meeting about the transit center. So I imagine a lot of overlap there.
Okay. Well, either way, we're gonna talk about it.
Hey, John, this is Carl. Couple of thoughts on that. Happy New Year, by the way.
Happy New Year to you.
I think you and Dennis have done a really good job of just, being involved in Livable Frederick and the framework that encompasses that. So I think it's the charrettes that I've been involved with, what we've done as an ownership is really provided a vision for the folks that are conducting the charrette. And then what they did is they put together, a couple of different concepts with the feedback that we gave them. And then we kind of started that process. And I found that it was very, very productive, that they had at least a baseline to start with. So I would agree with the other members here. I would encourage you guys, and it sounds like Dennis is deflecting to you, John, that you should, put together this vision of what you think it should look like, and then present it to the group and let us give you feedback. I think that's a that's really a good baseline or a good place to start.
Well, yeah, that makes sense to me too. I mean, I think it's having something to react to works for everybody. You know, part of my hesitation was I didn't want to kind of give the appearance that we were kind of dictating anything from on high. And, you know, I think it's pretty clear to most people that that's not what the case is, but there's still kind of a hesitation based on that. But I mean, just talking to you guys now, it seems to make sense that probably the most productive way to go is like what you're saying, to produce something that people can react to understand, and then just make it better from there, like iterate it and understand what to change and what to keep. I think it makes a lot of sense.
I think I like what your approach is, and I think in those instances where you can provide case example for our public to understand this design is something that's similar to what we see in Rockville Town Center, then they'll get it. You know, now they have a kind of an apple to apple type of comparison, and then they can kind of think through some of those design concepts. It's just something that can help the public to kind of get into that mindset.
Okay, that makes sense. I hear an echo. Echo. Stopped. All right. Well, anyway, on that note, if unless anybody else has something they want to contribute here, we can maybe shift gears and let Dennis present his Rockville Town Center case study.
We good? Hey, John, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Can
Mm-hmm.
you hear me? I'm having a problem with my sharing. If you can talk for a minute, I can get set up. I might have to leave the meeting and come back in.
Okay. Sure.
Okay. Sorry about that.
So, Immanuel Kant or Heidegger, who was most effectively? All right, I don't know. Let's talk about Donald Trump.
No.
And the storming of the Capitol. Yeah. What'd you all do during break?
Watched an insurrection.
Now you got them started.
Yeah, you shouldn't have started that, John. You shouldn't have started that.
I know, exactly. Let's talk about your puppy. That's a safer topic.
I could go grab him and show him to you.
Well, you know, I'm a little concerned because my puppy today managed to get a thumbtack off of our corkboard, and he's done it a few times, and we've managed to scoop it out every time. But today he actually swallowed one, so we're actually a little concerned. I'm not sure if I should call the veterinarian or not. Have you guys ever experienced anything like that?
I think you should. I think you should call the vet. Just let them know. Yeah, we had a friend that their dog liked to eat razor blades. Not like they would go into the tub and chew whatever like razor blade was in the tub. You know, like disposal razor. And yeah, you definitely want to go get that one checked out.
Good tip.
It's nice having a puppy support group here.
Puppies are cute though. I support having a puppy. My puppy is right over there. He's 9 now. Mr. Patrick Murray.
That's your dog's name?
He'll come around here and he's my buddy.
Yeah. You know, I've been a cat person my entire life. And we got a dog because my son and daughter insisted. And I was like, not really sure about the whole thing. But now it's just, you know, I love that dog so much. She's such a sweetie. She's a part of the family. It's funny. Never thought I'd be a dog person.
Welcome to the club.
Yeah.
Dogs
Yeah.
are the best.
Yeah. Puppies and dogs think that you're just the best thing ever, and they show it.
That's right.
Trained rabbits. Trained rabbits are great house pets.
Oh, really?
Oh yeah, my rabbit knows quite a few commands, and actually she trained us because when she runs out of food, she bangs on a particular loud thing in her area, and my husband runs down and feeds her because we can hear her upstairs. So we trained her, and then she trained us.
That's funny.
So
Yeah, we're going to have a bell by our back door for whenever it wanted to go out, but it didn't totally work out, and we're kind of glad because now she goes to the door like almost every 10 minutes and is scratching on the door, and it's much easier to listen to a scratch than it is to hear a bell like every 5 minutes.
The bell's the way to go. We have our bell, and we just got a new front door. But here's our bell right here. I have to reinstall it, but it works great.
Yeah, we put a little dog door in our screen door in our back, so our dog can kind of go in and out.
There we go.
Do a business. Yay! All right.
Sorry about that. Can
Okay.
everybody hear me?
Yep.
Yep.
My audio is coming through. Okay. I really apologize for that. Got a new computer. That's what I did over my Christmas vacation. So didn't have the app installed. I'm going to walk everybody through a little bit of a timeline for Rockville that leads up to the development of the town, what we know as the town center. And there's a reason behind that. I'm not just doing this to fill time or to fill space, because there is a history to Rockville that is a little bit different than most places that are subject to redevelopment. And that is the fact that Rockville has already been redeveloped in the modern era. It was a test bed for urban renewal concepts in the late 50s and early 60s. Most people would agree not successfully so. And that laid the framework for a couple of things. One, it created an environment politically and in the community that permitted people to understand that they could actually bring about change, sometimes radical change in their environments, with the participation of private landowners, corporations, transportation authorities, local government, and citizens. So where a lot of communities are facing redevelopment or new development options, sometimes you don't have that built-in human capacity of understanding that things can actually be made to happen. I think a lot of us have probably worked in jurisdictions or neighborhoods or in families sometimes where there's a lack of vision or a lack of understanding that change can be brought forward. And Rockville is not that. And we're going to take a look at real quickly some of the fundamentals behind Rockville. Everybody probably is very clear with where Rockville is, but if you are not, it is on the 270 corridor between Frederick and Washington, D.C., probably about 2/3 of the way down. It's the county seat for Montgomery County. Montgomery County was once part of Frederick County. They split off, I believe, around the time of the Declaration of Independence, if my history is correct. It was originally known as it was a little crossroads place called Hungerford's Tavern because there was a Hungerford's Tavern, which notably was where local folks in the area gathered to discuss their reaction to the Boston Tea Party. So that's kind of neat. Then it was known as Montgomery Courthouse, which is like, a file folder on your computer being called folder. Montgomery Courthouse, it served as the county seat and the official courthouse for Montgomery County. And then for a brief time, it was known as Williamsburg because of a local developer seeking to expand the village. In 1805, the name Rockville started to stick. The Rockville and Georgetown Turnpike was chartered, That's now Hungerford Drive 355. And this, of course, as you might guess from the name, connected Rockville and Georgetown in the district. That turnpike actually continues up into Frederick under different names. There was an old crossing at the Monocacy River that you can still wander down. If you're on the Monocacy battlefield, you can still wander down and see the old crossing. There was a little inn and a couple of toll houses, toll gates as well. Anyway, so from the beginning, Rockville was being established as a transportation kind of through center. It was incorporated right before the Civil War as Rockville. In 1873, they get their other injection of transportation goodness when the B&O Railroad's Metropolitan Branch through Rockville. And there was a station built along the railroad tracks, which run roughly parallel to the current Maryland 355. And the town, or the village, for what it was at the time, actually built a boardwalk, which would be the pre-concrete sidewalks of the 18th and 19th century. They built a boardwalk connection between the downtown area and the railroad depot. Many of you may be familiar with the Rockville Railroad Station, the B&O station. It's kind of hidden behind St. Mary's Catholic Church. It was notably picked up and moved when Metro expanded to its Red Line service up to this part of the region to avoid having to demolish it. They actually picked the building up, brought it 30 or 40 feet south, and flipped it 180 degrees. So the train platform now faces an internal street. It's kind of weird. Anyway, in 1890, not too many years later, the Rockville and Tenleytown Railway started service. That was a trolley service. City of Rockville also kind of using their leverage at the time for passage through Rockville, told the trolley company they had to build a connection out to westward of the downtown to what is now, or what was previously known as Chestnut Lodge. It was a hotel, notable hotel at the time. So from the beginning, you had B&O railroad service, you had electrical railway service. By the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, Rockville remains pretty quiet. They adopt their first zoning ordinance in 1932. In 1946, they installed their first parking meters, which for a lot of people warrants, or marks the beginning of the end for downtown areas when you ended up having to pay for parking. But that happened right after the war. And by that time, the other major factor that comes into play is in full effect, in that Rockville is now annexing huge swaths of land. I think in 1949, they annexed upwards of 2,000 or 2,500 acres to the south and east of the city. So they were growing pretty rapidly. 1951, Hungerford Drive was established. That's Maryland 355 as you're passing through Rockville right now in the modern day. That was actually built as a bypass. The old turnpike, the old Rockville Pike used to pass right through the town, the city center, and it was kind of circuitous, came to a little intersection. So they built Hungerford Drive, which is how most people experience Rockville now, kind of sandwiched between the metro station and what we know of as the Rockville Town Center. In 1956, they established the first planning commission, pretty much in line with many jurisdictions in the state of Maryland. 1957, see some other harbingers here. Rockville Pike is widened to 4 lanes. US 240, which became I-270, opened through Rockville, west of the downtown, bypassing the downtown completely. 1958 and 59, you got new water system coming up from the Potomac River, serving the city of Rockville. And if anybody knows where Congressional Plaza is or used to be, that actually used to be the old Congressional Airport. And Congressional Plaza basically was built on top of the footprint of the old Congressional Airport. Anybody ever go roller skating at the old Congressional skating rink? Anybody grow up around this area? Anyway, the old Congressional skating rink was the airport's major or main hangar. So a little bit of history there. 1959, there was a study. So by the late 1950s, we're in the throes of urban renewal. The suburban America is growing in leaps and bounds. There's money available for returning veterans to build homes. Communities are being established. And Rockville decides to take a look at their central business district and identify what was wrong with their district. And a couple of things they identified were that there was too much traffic. There were a lot of traffic jams. There wasn't very good parking. They were losing retail. All of these things are incredibly ironic given what then happens in the ensuing 50 or 60 years. But that first study from 1959 kind of set the stage for what was going to happen. Because in 19, there was a preliminary urban renewal plan that was completed for the area. And you can see that fanciful illustration on the bottom of the screen there. That was developed by an architect, of course, you can tell from the drawing. And he was kind of laying out the basic ideas that were being shared by the community and by its business leaders. They wanted a major department store. They wanted high-rise housing to support the town center. They wanted a new government center. Basically, they were looking to rework the entirety of the central business district in this new kind of modern fashion. And it included a transit hub, which you can kind of see on the very bottom of that illustration. At the same time, you have the first, what we would call kind of planned unit development starting to sprout up in Montgomery County, and that included in Rockville. They're called PRU developments, and they start to come of age in the early 1960s. 1964, 65, the Capital Beltway opens. So once again, you're looking at, additional highway access. 1965, Rockville makes the decision to start demolishing its downtown. They knock down, I think, upwards of 111, 120 buildings. They abandon a few roadways. They relocate a few roadways. They effectively level what was a functional small town in Maryland for this new vision of kind of a more modern city. A year later, they established their historic district. Again, not completely detached from the decision to raise the downtown. There were threats to St. Mary's Catholic Church, and that kind of got a lot of people in the area to kind of rise up. You have some prominent modern buildings going up at the time in the late 50s and early 60s. The Suburban Trust Bank building, which is on the lower part of the screen here, which to a lot of you may just look like, like blah, what the hell is that? Well, it's a pretty prominent example of architecture at the time. One notable component of this building and others like it was that it accommodated the car. So it's got the bank drive-throughs built into it. It was called the Pink Building for many years because it had this pink granite. The fire station is built. The 60s are just like this time of hope, and new things are being built, and it's a big exciting time, and we're going to the moon, and everybody's just basically hopped up on like, let's do it all again, let's start fresh. 1971, they opened up a brand new downtown Rockville library. I was there at the opening. It's very exciting. I met a live action Curious George. So 1972, the Rockville Mall opens up. So the Rockville Mall is this major component of this urban renewal project. So they've shifted from having a department store presence, originally identified in their 1959 plan, to now having this mall. And the mall would include 40 shops, and it was supposed to have 2 anchor stores. One of the anchor stores never got filled. The other anchor store, Landsberg's, lasted about a year before the entire company folded and went out of business. So almost from the beginning, Rockville Mall had no anchor stores, and at no point in its history did it ever have more than 60% occupancy in this thing. And what you're looking at in the middle of this image, I'd forgotten about this until I pulled this photograph up. There was this like weird ramp that took you like off of 355 up into the structured parking. So this was all about the car. And if anybody remembers the Rockville Mall, it was essentially a huge monolithic concrete brutalist building slapped in where there used to be kind of this functional, cute downtown. And people pretty much treated it that way. It was pretty much a dead mall from the beginning in the early 1970s. And I think the city didn't take long for them to figure that out. By 1975, they were adopting new zoning codes. They were starting to address mixed use, and they were already starting to rethink what they needed to do in the downtown area. 1981, the Ride-On bus, the local transit service, begins serving Rockville. That is moved so they can accommodate the new Metro rail station, which opens in 1984. Early 80s sees the construction of the new Judicial Center, an executive office building. So it really cements Rockville as this kind of office environment for government employees. And then we come upon the early 90s. So between the opening of the metro station in 1984 and the early 90s, Rockville realizes the mall is a bust. What you're looking at here on this image is a very rare aerial photograph of the Rockville Mall, and you can kind of see what I'm talking about. It's just this big rectangle. And it was very uninviting, to anybody on the street in this area. It was pretty horrific. In addition to the fact that it was a failure as a business venture as well. But in 1993, 94, they start to demolish the mall. There's actually one little piece of it that remains, which is kind of an aging fitness center that's located right on Hungerford Drive, right across the street from the metro station. That's the only physical remains of this mall. 1996 sees the restoration of the old red courthouse. 1997, there's a visioning process called Imagine Rockville that goes on. They establish a nice courthouse square park in front of the courthouse. So when urban renewal swept through Rockville, they eliminated the street that the courthouse actually faced. I mean, they eliminated the street network. So they had room to kind of place this little park square, which they did. And in the late 1990s, they start to reestablish that original gridded street network in the city.
Dennis,
Yes.
when they started actively including the public as part of their revisioning of this area?
Yeah, 1997 is really that Imagine Rockville was the first kind of mass public invitation to rethink what they needed to do with Rockville. But they followed up very quickly in 2001 with the adoption of a master plan for the city, and there was quite a bit of public involvement there as well. In one sense, things move very quickly. When thinking about our process, things are moving pretty quickly in Rockville through these decades. You really go from kind of the burgeoning urban renewal era of the early 60s to the end, like within 20 years. I mean, it fizzles really fast. And there's a very short period of time in the 1980s while everything else is going nuts economically, where Rockville is really languishing, and they're trying to figure out like what they need to do to kind of capture some of that energy. And that kind of comes together in that Imagine Rockville effort. Some of the things that come out of that on the private side are that Regal Cinemas establishes a movie theater in the town center. It's kind of the first of the new, like the renewal squared. It's one of the first new things that are constructed in this new idea of envisioning Rockville as a vibrant town center again. The Rockville Town Square, which is the development I think that a lot of us associate with the town center. This Town Square development breaks ground in 2004 and has a grand opening in 2007. So we'll get to that in a second about the differentiation there. 2011, they get a major new office component with the headquarters of CHI, which is a international hotel conglomerate. They open up their headquarters there. They get an actual hotel in 2015. And by 2019, kind of bringing us up to date, you have an Urban Land Institute study Urban Land Institute team is brought in by the city to identify strategies for rejuvenating the lagging downtown center. So, there's a lot going on here in a very small period of time. So Rockville Town Center or Rockville Town Square, like what the hell are we talking about? So you can see in this image, this red line kind of delineates this piece of the downtown center in Rockville. That's actually the Rockville Town Square. So that's this, private development with significant public assistance, but it's a private development, and it's pretty limited to 5 or 6 city blocks there. But the town center is kind of a much larger. The town center extends south towards the government center. It extends a little bit to the east onto Rockville Pike and the metro station, which you can see in the bottom right-hand corner, and it extends to the north and to the west into some of those kind of nascent commercial and residential areas as well. And there's still confusion for a lot of folks when they use the word town center or town square, what people are actually talking about. And the Urban Lands Institute actually identified that as one of the issues that needed to be addressed. I mean, here's what you're looking at with Old Rockville. Right, here's Montgomery Avenue. This is Georgetown Road. This is essentially 355. It came right into the town center, and then you kind of made your way up Washington Street and Frederick Road, and you went upward north into Upper Montgomery County. Now, if you came down this road, Georgetown Road, 355 more or less follows the boundary here of this old map. So, if you're trying to establish where the hell you are in the last 150 years, and if I grab somebody from 1890 and I drop them in downtown Rockville in 1980, they're going to be completely lost. They're probably going to start crying, roll up, ball up into the fetal position. If you drop them there now, they might have a better shot of trying to figure out what's going on because the courthouse is still there. Some of the street network has been reestablished, Washington Street and Maryland Avenue. So a time traveler from 1890 might have a better shot now than they would have 20 or 30 years ago. But this is essentially what was Rockville before. Again, small scale, small town, post office, courthouse, movie theater, drugstore. This was the urban renewal concept, and what you actually get is something a little bit, kind of in between. And this is what really kind of drives what Rockville is dealing with now, because in no small part, not only is Rockville trying to reestablish and redevelop a thriving mixed-use commercial center, but they're having to undo some of the previous urban renewal from the 1960s at the same time. So they are truly like juggling, and they got a couple of balls in the air, maybe a couple that have fallen and hit the ground already. But you can see, the suburban development that was pressing Rockville in the 1950s continues today. Rockville still continues to grow. I think in 1940, the population of Rockville was something like 2,400. Now it's probably 70,000. So it's grown a bit, and you can see it in their proposed land use plans too over time. This is 1960. This deep red area is more or less the town center. And you can see it in 1970 that they're still maintaining that town center, but you start to see a lot of other growth kind of creeping up and down 355, extending into some of the suburban developments. By 1993, Rockville is growing to the north and to the south. You have the kind of the Rio Washingtonian development to the north. You have Pike and Rose, kind of being considered on the south. And by 2002, those plans are in full effect. So now Rockville is not only competing with the greater development of the region, but it's also competing to some extent with itself, with these other kind of nodes of economic activity, still looking for some way to identify itself and differentiate itself in the marketplace. If you look at this as as eras. You have kind of like the pre-war era, you have the urban renewal era, coupled with suburbanization. And then you have kind of this in-between time in the 80s where people are starting to figure out that things failed. And then you're kind of moving swiftly into, for lack of a better way to frame it, a transit-oriented development with the hopes of kind of keying in on the metro access, which is like right there. And this transportation access tells you a lot about why Rockville A, continues to struggle, and B, needs to continue to work at it because they've got some fundamentals in place to work with. The old B&O railroad station you can see in this image is, it's just right across the road from the kind of the edge of the town center area. Station, which is in the upper part of that photograph, is even closer to the town center. But to get there, you have like this kind of concrete pedestrian bridge, a not very friendly approach from that particular angle. Here's an illustrative plan for their Rockville Town Center master plan. This is what was developed in the early 2000s that has eventually turned into the development that we see today. And again, you can see that the focus is on reestablishing the street grid, making it much more pedestrian friendly, pedestrian in character, making strong connections to the Metro Plaza area so that you can bring people in off of the metro station to work and shop and live in the area. The Rockville Town Center master plan that was developed was very visual, had a lot of kind of illustrations that, when you look at the illustrations now, they did a really bang up job kind of physically developing this area in a great way. I mean, it's just the environments are very pleasing. They checked a lot of the boxes in terms of urban design and creating environments that are pleasing for people to not just kind of move through, but to actually stick around. The city's programmed the town center area, so they have live concerts and they have events that occur down there. So they're kind of putting all the pieces together. They're doing the things that people like Kara do, and they're trying to make this work in this kind of brand new, relatively new area. They have this interesting little chart from their early 2000s plan, where they're kind of very pragmatic about it. You probably can't read it from there, but they're basically saying, their building blocks are their market opportunities, the goals and objectives kind of established by the business community, the existing conditions that they had to work with, which was fundamentally trying to undo the mid-60s urban renewal, and then the desires of the community, which, in some cases were, hey, we want new, fun, exciting places to live and shop. In other cases were, hey, you can do what you want, just don't mess with my neighborhood that's just adjacent to this downtown area. And it kind of gets filtered through, they set up a design framework and some guiding principles, and they apply their what they call their filters, which are kind of their regulatory regime and their funding mechanisms to actually get to actual projects, mostly built by the private sector. And so getting back to this town center or town square, once again, the town center is this larger area. It's about 60 acres, roughly triangular shaped, bounded by Hungerford Drive /355 on one side and North Washington Street on the other side. This town square plaza is what most of us who've been there probably recognize as the new development in Rockville. And this is where you have all of the restaurants and where you have the skating rink and the square of the plaza and the parking garages and the grocery stores and all in the library. So this is, I think, what most people associate with the renewed area in Rockville. But what's interesting is this illustration kind of tells you what's wrong right away. So here's Rockville Pike over on the right side, right? And you have some street trees, and you have the Metro Plaza, which is in part some of the remnants of the old Rockville Mall, and you have some typical CVS stores and Gold's Gym and things. But the bulk of the new stuff, what we would kind of look at as being kind of the cool stuff, the streetscapes that are great for walking and hanging out with your kids, all that is really hidden. And the city really dropped the ball in terms of letting people know that this has even been happening. And the town square folks, this private group that manages the area, they're doing what everybody does with these types of projects. They've got the website. It's a lifestyle center of sorts. They're focused almost solely on the restaurant, entertainment, and small scale retail. And it's so this aspect of it is what a lot of us have seen start to fail over the last 5 years. There's been an increase in retail vacancies. Um, you've seen some areas that have developed and built with first floor retail that has not been fully occupied. And that's a huge problem because this town center lives and dies through its retail component. You can see the original master plan from that turn of the last century. It was a 60-acre area. Included the library, the Metro Plaza, the Arts Center, mixed use focus. But they were only calling for, not even 700 new dwelling units, about, less than 200,000 square foot of retail and restaurant, a couple thousand parking spaces, 1,000 of which would be public, and a fair amount of public support on the financing side to try to make this happen. They established these key guiding principles, and these are some things that I think we can learn from as we're looking at our plan. Their guiding principles have served them well, I think, even with the notable failures that we're going to talk about. The guiding principles kind of remain in place for them. It gives them some way to orient themselves as they try to move forward. So it's basically organizing the entire area around this L-shaped pedestrian-oriented spine. Not a problem there. They've really done a great job with that. It's hidden, but they've really put some of their best development faces on this spine, which is mostly a north and south spine, but also kind of connects you over to the metro station. They really firmly established North Washington Street as an edge, which is something else we need to think about as we look at our area. Like where does it stop? Where are the edges? We are pretty safe on the south, right? We've got the Battlefield Park, so we're not going to be growing beyond that. We have things like the quarry, which may or may not serve as kind of a hard edge. We have I-70 on the north, which is a harder edge. So Rockville had to do this kind of artificially by saying we don't want this new development spilling out into some of the residential neighborhoods, and they did that by establishing this boundary and keying in on it as one of their guiding principles. They were also very adamant that connectivity, when they reestablished the street grid, that they were not going to let that compromise pedestrian character, and I think they've done a decent job of that. This is interesting. One of their guiding principles is to maintain the metro station as a recognizable presence, which just seems like the weirdest possible way to phrase that. And it may, in some part, kind of lead to one of the issues, which is, how do you get from the metro station into the town center? Why would you want to go there? How do you get there? And what is that experience like? And then another thing they were very strongly attuned to was making sure that even though they wanted the town center to be connected to adjacent neighborhoods, they didn't want traffic flowing into those neighborhoods and having those neighborhoods serve as kind of like the backup vehicular network for the town center. And this thing was all about partnerships. The one thing you can say about Rockville over the last 70 years is the partnerships have been very strong between private sector, government, and the neighborhood groups and the other folks, the other ad hoc groups that participate. The government role was interesting, and this is something else we really need to think about in terms of South Frederick. What Rockville did in their initial urban renewal efforts, and then even a little bit with this renewed renewal, was they helped with site assembly, understanding that the private sector might have a tougher time being able to make that happen. effectively or efficiently. So the government stepped in and did some site assembly to allow some of the smaller parcels to be put together into more developable and more manageable sites. They established a parking district, which was basically a funding mechanism to allow for structured parking and more intense parking. They set up a regulatory framework that would allow for these new types of places and spaces and buildings, fundamentally through increasing the maximum height, establishing the street grid, and by requiring first level, street level retail and entertainment and restaurant uses. So,
Hey, Dennis, could I
yeah,
jump in with a question?
yeah,
The parking district here, do you know how that was funded for the incentives to construct parking structures?
yeah. So there's public and private structured parking, and I think out of the couple thousand of spaces that did, I want to say more than half are public. Um, there was a large government component of funding for this, and one thing that's interesting when you look at the funding for the whole project, there's obviously a huge amount of private funding. There is city funding that goes into helping to do some of the site assembly and to underwrite some of the parking structure development. There is state funding involved through several different programs, and there's also federal money at work here. But the structured parking was definitely heavily subsidized, and the parking district, I think, is kind of the mechanism through which that process can kind of recoup some of the cash. Right now, uh, one of the issues that came out of the Urban Land Institute study was that parking was not working here. Uh, there's a perceived, it's probably more perceived rather than actual cumbersome character to the parking here. People, when asked, when prodded, would volunteer that it was easier to park at a place like Pike and Rose or at Rio Washingtonian than it was here, even though there's ample spaces here. I think to some extent the structured parking combined with kind of a changing parking validation strategy. So it's not unlike a lot of places. You can park in the garage for a couple of hours. You come back, you buy something, you buy a cup of coffee or a suit or whatever. You can get your parking ticket validated, and so it's free parking. That's still a bit of a lift for a lot of people accustomed to a suburban environment where you just simply pull up, park, and walk to a store. So there's definitely a perception that the parking is difficult here, even though it seems to be kind of organized pretty well. It seems to be situated in a way that would maximize its availability for the heaviest uses. But there's definitely the government component for funding for those structures. The city of Rockville also did some marketing for potential residential sites. That was something that was identified early on. And I'm not sure what they meant by marketing initially in the plan, but I think the city was really just kind of identifying through its normal processes where there might be better chances of accommodating residential growth. And I think they've continued to push that with developers in the last decade. And there was, prior to the collapse in 2007 and 2008, there was this Live Near Work program where you had basically subsidized components of purchasing a condominium or a house given through an employer, I think using government funds, public funding. And that program, I do not believe, still exists. On the regulatory side, they took some big steps here, and some of these are things that we might start to consider as well. One was this requirement for street level retail. So learning their lesson from the urban renewal era, City of Rockville really wanted to make sure that they didn't create dead zones, in their new development by having restaurants and entertainment and retail active on that first level. One of the areas that has been identified as problematic is the fact that the library occupies a fairly big chunk of one of these blocks and is considered by other retailers to be a dead zone for retail. But for the most part, the city has really continued to press that street level retail. And when they do that, it kind of comes with a couple of bonuses. That street level retail essentially gives you a height bump because they don't start counting your maximum building height until 16 feet. So you basically get your first story and a half for free, and then your height limitation. So your ultimate density and what you can pull out of the site in terms of developability is increased a little bit. They also did something. Sorry, go ahead. Somebody have a question? They also had this other thing where if a private developer came in with a plan that facilitated one of the street extensions that was identified in their master street network plan, they would allow access to the kind of the newer zoning that would allow for more of this flexibility, greater density, greater intensity, range of uses as well. They also established an urban design overlay district, which again, on the, if you're kind of looking at each of these components as pass fail, the urban design is pretty well done in the town center area, in the town square area at least. Still working on it in the town center generally. They do allow for some surface parking, so they're not purists about it, but it's really minimized. And I think there's a square foot limit. I think it's about an acre. That's kind of like where you can max out, and you have to kind of jump through a bunch of hoops to get there. But they do allow some surface parking to be accommodated, which I think has been a good thing as they transition. And they recalibrated all of their zoning districts. They already had mixed use zoning in the town center, but they recalibrated everything to really kind of push that idea. So pretty much everything now in this town center area is kind of mandated as mixed use.
What was the recalibration for? Was it to go ahead and give it a little bit higher density, or a different a portfolio of mixed use?
Yeah, both or all. They basically did all of that. They increased the range of uses, they increased the height, they increased density. They added they added additional mixed use areas within the district. It was a way, I think, it was a way for the city to basically send the message that, like, this is how we want folks to develop. We want it to be a mix of uses. There's a little bit of flexibility, but we really need to put homes. We need to put people who are going to shop and live here to help the businesses be more successful. It's just, it's kind of development 101 in terms of what they were trying to do. Whether or not they were completely successful is another issue. I'm just going to show you a few images here before we get into some of the conclusions. This is what you have now. In terms of the physical design, in terms of the architecture, in terms of the streetscapes, the town center and the town square areas are fairly successful. They're pleasant physical places to occupy. The buildings are varied. They're interesting. They're not monolithic. There's a lot of things going on in terms. They change things up at the pedestrian level to make it a little more interesting. They integrate classic kind of step back regulatory rules to allow a little bit more light to kind of hit the street level. Lots of little pocket parks, little like accidental open spaces. So that's all done very well. And then you got the, check all of your neo town center, lifestyle center boxes here. You've got the ice/roller skating rink. You've got the place for the live concerts. You've got the picnic areas. You've got the splash garden. It's almost like a satirical approach to doing these kinds of developments, and that they've really done everything that anybody else brings to these kinds of developments, and they've done it pretty well. They have a nice prominent piece of architecture here with the clock tower. It's I got to say, it's just as jaundiced as I can be about these places. It's a nice space, and it really can function in the way that it was anticipated, save for a couple of issues. And you can see some other images here. You can see a little bit more of the kind of the street fabric. There's sculpture, there are planters, and it's not all the same, which is another thing I think that's important, an important takeaway. You don't kind of walk through this area and go, oh yeah, right, there's more of those, concrete planters, whatever. It seems to change block by block. And this was intentional. And on the private sector has done a spectacular job of providing architectural responses to this area, where they honestly could have been lazy and just simply kind of phoned it in. They've done some really nice buildings, which is really nice to see. This image up here is interesting. You can kind of see the old tower from the 60s, early 70s, and the Regal theaters, which basically sit on the footprint of the old Rockville Mall. That's kind of like one end of square area. But overall, it's been a great approach that way in terms of the physical design. And when the Urban Land Institute went out there to study it in the summer of 2019, they identified a few problems. One was that the entrances or the approaches to this area were really hidden or poorly done. And what they said the city needed to work on was kind of making sure you knew when you've arrived at this Rockville Town Center. There are good examples that we can point to. There are really bad examples. Unfortunately, in this case, Rockville has presented a couple of really bad examples, not the least of which is the pedestrian walkway from the metro station into the town center area. You feel like you're in a dystopian, it's like Soylent Green or Planet of the Apes or something. It's just like, it's really poorly done. And they said that this was something that the city could work on, obviously with the private sector, participating to kind of make a more inviting entryway, both for cars and for people on foot. They also kind of looked at the retail footprint, and there's like 500,000 square feet of retail here. That includes the entertainment uses and the restaurants and such. And when ULI ran the numbers based on the kind of the catchment area in terms of residents and office workers, they said really using the kind of the national standard, which I think is like 25 square feet per capita, that this area should have no more than like 400,000 square feet of retail, and they were already at 500,000. So one of their recommendations was to shrink that retail footprint, really condense it, try not to overserve the area. You had all kinds of, as you might notice it when you're out there, there's cannibalizing of restaurant themes and retail concepts. And it's not set up right now to really promote successful retail when somebody can come in and compete immediately and kind of water down the entire marketplace. So they put forward a bunch of ideas, like maybe kind of thinking about natural themes that have developed there. There's a lot of Asian restaurants, and maybe this becomes like the Asian food hub for the DC metro area or something. So they were throwing ideas out that would allow the city to kind of focus a little bit instead of trying to do it all. There was a grocery store that opened up, Dawson's Market. I think it closed. I think it then reopened with public support. There's still the need for groceries. And when it comes down to it, there's some key uses that you need to have in a livable town center. You need a pharmacy, you need a grocery store, you need someplace to go hang out and eat and get drunk, which I've talked about before. Someplace to go play, someplace to go walk, someplace to work, a way to get to transportation choices, and Rockville seems to be hitting a lot of this, just not not all the time.
So you were just mentioning earlier about another store coming in that was more affordable. Were they experiencing an issue where they had too many high-end stores that the neighborhood could not support, or was the demographic of the residential unit not being matched with the kind of retail offering that would serve that market?
ULI kind of identified both. They basically said, look, you've got 17,000 people that live within a mile. You also have thousands of people that come in here to work every day. Those are two distinct markets in terms of, with some, with some significant overlap, but those are distinct markets. Who are you trying to sell to? Like figure out who you're marketing to, work with your private partners on this and figure out like what your market is. They also identified the fact that about 3/4 of a mile north of the town center is Montgomery College. That's 15,000 students. Obviously less so during COVID, but in normal times, it's like between 12 and 15,000 students on that campus with like one cafe on campus and a Chipotle, which is I think 3 miles away or 2 miles away. And they were like, why, you're so close. Why not kind of start to think about that as a potential outreach? How can you make this town center more accessible to the Montgomery College folks? It brings in like thousands of shoppers and eaters and dancers and drinkers into your town center, or work with the college maybe to set up like one of their programs in the town center. Even better, kind of bring some, more of this like 18-hour activity center concept. But they identified it was to answer your question, they identified all of it. It was some of the retail was not geared to match the needs of the surrounding communities. Some of the retail was not geared to match the folks who were there on a daily basis to come and work. So some of their, in the ULI study, they basically talk about this condensed retail core. They talk about a shuttle bus or like localized transit to try to get, Montgomery College students down into the town center to show them that it was easier than getting in their car and driving 3 miles in the opposite direction. Looking at this top left-hand image, you have these proposed entrance and open spaces to really look at opening this thing up so that people know it's there, so people feel welcomed, accommodated when they're visiting the town center. I think there's here's a kind of a detail on the retail. This image on the right, this green map shows like the density of retail within like whatever 3, 5, 10 minutes of Rockville Town Center. And you've got Pike and Rose. Now you'll have the upcoming, White Flint area being developed. You've got the areas just north of the city and southern Gaithersburg. I think places like King Farm and Washingtonian. There's a lot of retail saturation in Rockville. They really need to focus if they're going to try to make this work as a retail hub, as a retail core. So that was definitely one of the takeaways we can consider in our own planning is that right now the South Frederick corridors is a huge retail hub. It's a kind of a micro regional retail hub, and we have to make, as a community, we have to make decisions about where we see that going. And maybe the lesson from Rockville is to make sure that we're not throwing the baby out with the bathwater, or maybe it's trying to understand where we need to focus new types of retail, entertainment, restaurant development, and not oversaturate our own market. And obviously, this is something that is so important to have the lines of communication opened up to our private partners, because they're the ones who are going to be most sensitive to market trends, market needs, the forces, where the money is coming from, the color of the money that can be used to kind of see these projects through. And this is another thing, I've talked to people about this idea of the transit area monocracy, right? And I think we've talked about the fact that there are a lot of people in Frederick County who don't even know that the station's back there. You tell them about a train station in back of Target, and they kind of look at you like you're from Mars. In Rockville, the ULI kind of identified something similar. I mean, these kinds of views, this is the kind of approach you get to the Rockville Town Center, these top 3 images when you get off of the metro train. And so, our faddish, the High Line in New York City, which gets brought up in pretty much every single presentation I'm looking at these days, is brought up for a good reason. It's a really inviting way to get people to move across what could otherwise be a pretty mundane or dystopian device. In this case, the High Line in New York City, if you're not familiar with it, is an old elevated railroad that runs through some of the industrial sections of New York City. Here, ULI was like, hey, think about, doing something similar, here. Do what you can to make this a more enjoyable experience moving from the transit station into the active town center area. And that's something that we can think about doing as we move forward. Not, and where we differ maybe is that we do have development capacity right around the station. We do have that advantage that Rockville doesn't have, but we still want to be able to come up with a way of linking the areas as they redevelop over the decades such that people don't feel trapped on one side of the roadway or the other. And, not saying that that's going to be a Highline styled pedestrian bridge, but, we do need to think about what it takes to get human beings to consider walking a half a mile. What does it take? You have to dangle in front of somebody to get them to make that kind of a journey. And I'll just finish up with this chart again. The city of Rockville is a very interesting study for many reasons, not the least of which because it's been a spectacular failure a couple of times. But I think more importantly is that they have really embraced this idea of adopting a vision, something that guides all the smaller moves along the way so that they can kind of keep their eyes on the prize. But they're also very pragmatic about it. They're also very clear that, if public and private partners aren't working together, it's not likely to be as successful as it otherwise could be. And I think that's an important lesson for us as we move forward with our project as well.
So can I just make a couple of comments? Because I can give you real life experience. I was involved in the phase 2 town center design guidelines, working group in Rockville. And I can tell you that phase 2, which was the side of that town square that would move you closer to the college. So if you're familiar with that area, the intersections kind of come to a point. So when you showed it was the upper tip of that rendering. And so there was way back when a whole phase 2 design that never's really been implemented. So, and you have to get also the cooperation of those property owners. So I don't know the details of why that didn't get developed as well as the main parts of it, but it certainly would have helped some of the, there was going to be road changes and all kinds of things that certainly would have helped some of the issues you're talking about entrance and I think, drawing people in from that other direction. The other thing I want to comment on is when you look at the side where that old mall was and where the Regal Cinema is, if you understand the layout of Rockville, all the government buildings for the most part are on that side. So when you get to the weekend and whatever, that's a dead zone. It's just like when you go to Washington, D.C., if you're in the area where there's a lot of government buildings, you don't have a lot of activity. You don't have a lot of entertainment going on. So that's a problem I think that Rockville, faces, is because that whole side surrounding this area becomes inactive after a certain time at night, and it becomes inactive on the weekends. Then the third thing I just want to mention is that I think should be given some consideration is that Rockville, the government, the city government did a lot in terms of trying to get funds together to work with some of the mom and pop businesses that existed in the area prior to. Those overheads prior to the town square development were much lower. And that was a lot of people in the city, were very attached to those businesses, very concerned. And, in that period of time, I don't know if it continues today, but back then the other struggle the city had was those surrounding neighborhoods that wanted to keep the integrity of those generational businesses, they tried to work out, an economic development scheme where they could try to retain. Now, in some cases it worked, and in some cases it didn't. But I think that's another important aspect. I don't think that was in your list originally when they were redeveloping the area.
Yeah, I completely agree. And it's funny that that's one of the mistakes that I think they did. It was an improved process the second time around. The urban renewal originally from the 1960s was much more harsh in terms of business relocations, and most of those businesses were never able to reestablish successfully anywhere. Particularly some of the smaller ones that owned their property, had relied on a clientele that was nearby. I mean, they just never came back. And the stories, I grew up in Rockville, and the stories from just a generation before me about these businesses that they used to frequent in the downtown area that weren't there anymore. I mean, they still talk about them on Facebook, or you go to a picnic or something, people are still talking about it. And
Right.
I think the city did a little bit better job this time around. And in some cases, you had some of the smaller chain stores involved as well. But I would agree, they probably, you can't really disassociate that kind of a business from its context without killing it.
Right.
What kind of
And
resources
I would
do we?
I just want to also really quick, and then I'm done, the timing was so bad because then the economic recession, when that town square opened, it had a lot of momentum and it had a lot of support within the city, and it was, very active. But when that recession hit, they have never really recovered from it.
Yeah.
Yes, I was going to make a comment about what kind of resources can we provide in Frederick County, so that as we start to look at some of these areas that are marked for redevelopment, that these smaller or mid-sized stores, retail stores, have some help or some kind of official that I think our business development group are pretty spectacular in terms of really attracting some companies into the area. I'm just wondering to what extent do we offer resources for the mid to smaller size retail stores?
I mean, as we move forward in this thing, I think that's a question that we have for our economic development folks and our existing retention programs. I think the county's been very focused. I'm talking about just the county, not the city or other municipalities here, but the county's been very focused on kind of retention for some of the larger employers over the decades. I think they've gotten much better in the last 10 years about kind of reaching out to smaller businesses and understanding that, if you can catch and save and help out a small business that employs 4 people now, you might end up with somebody that's employing 50 or 100 decade from now. And I think that's one of the things we need to identify in this plan. If we come up with something, I say we as the community come up with something that is radical in its timing, where it's not going to be an approach that happens over many, many decades, then we need to be more careful about how we think through parts of the project that could result in relocation or abandonment of businesses. And that may be a new muscle that we have to learn to exercise and flex in Frederick County. But I will make a note of that and ask our economic development folks directly what they have in place now.
Thank you.
Hey, Dennis, this is Carl. Great presentation. Actually, I learned a lot of history about Rockville, so that was great. Good stuff. But I do have a few follow-up questions. You had mentioned in 1965 that pretty much they made a decision to demo downtown Rockville. So I'm curious, how did they do that? I'm assuming that you still had a lot of private landowners or that own the buildings and so forth. So was it a public-private partnership, or how did they accomplish that?
During the urban renewal era, the federal government provided resources so that governments could go in and secure properties to make that happen. It was, it's interesting because I'm always torn. Like, some ideas can only be implemented in a big way. And for those ideas, maybe that kind of intervention is crucial. But clearly, the way it was practiced in a lot of places in the United States did not work out for most people, and that's one example. But there was outright purchase and forced purchase, I think, in a lot of cases. But interestingly, because of the hopefulness in the 50s and 60s, there were a lot of business owners who were more than happy to sell their property to new renewal, even though their particular business operations were not going to survive the redevelopment. If you read some of the old newspaper articles and some of the old newsletters, you just see this general excitement in the business community about this new place. And they just saw it as like the new opportunities that would present themselves. And like any redevelopment, you have kind of a group of before people and you have a group of after people. And it's like a Venn diagram where you're going to have some overlap. And it probably, requires a lot of forethought and a lot of luck to make sure as many of those people who want to stick around are able to do so. I mean, even when you're doing things like building the Purple Line, or if anybody remembers back to the construction of the metro system, as they tunneled under some of the streets in DC, they shut down lots of businesses. I mean, a lot of businesses went under, kind of waiting for those tunnels to be finished. And I'm laughing. It's not funny. I mean, the Purple Line, I have a feeling, is doing the same thing to a lot of street level businesses now. And so, like getting a surgical procedure, that at the end, your arm is going to be better. It's going to function or whatever. But getting from broken arm to functioning arm requires the thing to be set up in a cast and surgeries and pins. And, the fact they were able to do that in the 50s and 60s was precisely because there was this huge federal effort and a lot of resources behind it.
Well, and the obvious reason I'm bringing it up is that, by way of example, we own 40 acres in Gaithersburg, right at Montgomery Village Avenue and I-270. Everybody knows it as the old IBM site. Right?
Yeah.
Those buildings were built back in the late 60s, early 70s. So they've gone through and recycled a couple of different times, but at the end of the day, they're at the end of their useful life. So we took on the obligation of buying the property with the notion that we're going to redevelop it. As a matter of fact, we're in the process now of knocking down the buildings and going through the entitlement process with the city of Gaithersburg. But I guess my point is, in the area that we're looking at, a lot of those facilities were built, in the 90s, early 2000s. So they still have a useful life to them at some level, right? So the question is, if we come in with this big plan to do a complete makeover, is there any public assistance that will help these owners that have struggled throughout the years, if to compensate them for redevelopment? I guess that's the big question. That's what I'm struggling with now, is that the product type that's there is not old enough to just knock it down, because it still has a useful life to it. So, how do we bridge that gap?
I think an interesting map of our study area would be one that was kind of based on exactly what you're talking about, kind of useful life of the structure of the site. Mm-hmm. Kind of see what we're working with, and there's some eye of the beholder element to this. A building that might look like it's seen better days to me might be absolutely fine. And it's classic. If you throw enough money and energy at something, you can make anything continue, as long as there's an economic utility behind it.
Sure.
I would say kind of my just gut reaction to that is that the larger, more significant of those uses that have a remaining useful life, that we would approach it in the same way that Rockville did, where we could create incentives that would say, if you can help us to accommodate, even in small part, some of this larger plan, you can have access to these additional benefits that allow you to redevelop, in a way that you might not otherwise be able to. That's kind of on the incentive side of things.
Right. So development standards that incentivize somebody to redevelop. Got it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
And some places, I think we can just be happy with, tweaks, and until that useful, life is finished. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I mean, we know that a lot of the structures in this area are relatively transient, up to have a 25 to 40-year lifespan. And you're right, a lot of it's built in the 80s and 90s, so it's still looking at like the last third of its life. But I think that what we're developing here is a longer range plan. The days of doing urban renewal, a la the 1960s, are thankfully long gone. And I think we're looking at a more piecemeal approach, but a piecemeal approach that all works to a common vision and a common plan. I think the most important element to us from the standpoint of continued redevelopment is probably the street network. That if we can establish a strong street network at the beginning and find innovative ways to kind of keep people on that network and doing things that service that network, I think we'll be in better shape, 50 years from now. How you get there is going to be interesting, but I think it's possible.
So
I would
I've got
also add
two more
Carl.
points, and then I'll shut up. You had brought up the purple line, and I'm glad you brought that up, because while you were speaking, I was listening, but I was looking at the MARC rail that goes behind Target, which I completely forgot about, right? And you had mentioned that. I looked up the schedule. It picks up riders at 6:05 a.m. in downtown Frederick and 6:11 at the Monocacy pickup point. Those are the only two times that you can pick up the MARC train. So in my mind, I agree with you. I think if the MARC train was the light rail, then I think it's a different ballgame. If you look at what's happening in Northern Virginia, that light rail goes up virtually all the way out to Leesburg. And it has absolutely exploded with development and vertical development in that corridor. And the reason for it is it gives riders multiple opportunities to jump on the train and go wherever. So I think with the way it's currently set up with the MARC train, not discounting it, but the way it's currently set up and the times available, I don't see that as a big draw to get people to live close to those stations with such a limited access, right? So that's point one. And the final point is you mentioned the Urban Land Institute. Have you guys talked to the Urban Land Institute about engaging them and getting some feedback from those folks on this specific study?
Not directly.
Okay.
I think that was another kind of lesson out of this, that like that's that access to ULI can be had through our relationship with the Washington Council of Governments. They have a program, I think it's called TAP. I get my acronyms mixed up, but that would be, I think, a great tool for us. ULI, for those of you who don't know, is a great partner in these kinds of projects, because they bring a lot of useful economic data to the table. They bring some economic know-how, development know-how, real estate know-how. So it's not simply people on the government side or on the planning side. I think it's something we need to really, really consider and try to find the resources and a means of inviting them in. I agree.
Yep, I agree. Yep. Okay, thanks, Dennis. Good work.
Thanks.
I kind of wanted to follow up on Carl's comment about the MARC train station, because I would agree today a number of trains we have is enough to get us where we want to go. But I know for downtown Frederick, like changes at the Point of Rock station could make a big difference immediately. So I think that we shouldn't discount the MARC train station, but we should see it as an asset that we could exploit, because there is the potential to have more train service. And quite honestly, there's a little bit of a chicken and the egg, which I'm sure Carl knows well in his line of work, of getting the train service is an attraction to having more residents, but then you can't get them more train service until you have more people. All of those kind of combination of all those kind of chicken and egg. But I really wouldn't want. I totally agree with Carl's assessment of the current situation, but I wouldn't want that to be the plan for moving forward. I'd like the plan to address the potential of the to be such a much better service to our community overall. And since I have the floor for a moment, I'm just going to say the retail conversation to me is very interesting for many, many reasons. Obviously, part of my job is supporting retail in downtown Frederick. And I know that retail has been suffering, and that's clearly the pandemic is a piece of it, but it's outside the pandemic, retail is suffering. And when I think of this corridor, quite honestly, I primarily think of big box national retailers. So I think it's really important to consider them separately from the little guys. And I remember the initial assessment that John and Dennis put together that was all this great information. And I remember it talking about retail, but I don't remember if you got to the depth of analyzing the retail in the sense of square footages and whether they're a locally owned business or if they're a national chain or all those kinds of things. But I think the strategies and the approach is different for those are like Target is totally different than, a little retail business on a main street. So I think that there might need to be more depth there. And I see it as being a really important place to focus energy, because we don't want to be in a place where we're hurting what we've already got. On the other hand, we know there's going to be change, and inevitably somebody gets hurt. Well, not inevitably, but oftentimes somebody gets hurt when change is made. So I just am curious. Maybe I don't remember, because I will freely admit I have not reread the briefing book for a month or so. My apologies. But I'm curious if there's more detail there on kind of the structure of the retail community.
You're on mute.
I was just moving my lips. I wasn't actually saying anything. I'm just joking. No, there isn't in the briefing book, and your point is very well taken. That is certainly an aspect that we need to dig into more deeply.
Just more as a point of reference, just to follow up to something I said earlier, I do know that in that initial phase of that town square area, I do think there was rent relief over a period of time offered to those kind of mom and pop businesses that did want to come back into that area and reestablish their businesses. So I just as a point of reference for everybody, I don't know the exact terms. I know it was over quite a few years, and it might have been a kind of similar approach, over time. But I know it did lower it and, made it below the market level that new businesses would be facing if they moved in. So.
And I always appreciate this referring to mom and pop businesses, but I also think that's a complication. So it's like, is Common Market a mom and pop because it's locally owned, even though it's not huge, but it's a large grocery store. So to me, there's like all of these nuances to that conversation that really complicate your planning process.
Right, and you raise a good point, because what about the new small businesses that move in? I was really focused on those businesses that had existed in that space prior to, right, who hope to try to survive the redevelopment, you know what I mean, and be in that area. So sorry, I may not have used the right lingo, but a lot of them were family owned. I just said it that way because a lot of them were family owned businesses.
No, I know. I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm just saying complicated part of this. Is like there's a tie to these ones that are family owned. And how do we? Is there a difference between a large family owned and a large chain owned? All of those are just. Right. I'm not saying I have an answer. I'm just saying they're complicated questions that we kind of have to go through to figure out what's most important in the process.
Right. Right.
So I just wanted to follow up and say thank you, Dennis, for this presentation. I found it very helpful. This may have been one of the most helpful to me case study presentations. And yeah, there's a lot of complicated issues. We already have a lot of commercial businesses in this area, whether they're smaller or larger or in between. I don't know that we have a lot of old mom and pop necessarily, but you know, there's a lot of business there, and we certainly want to make sure we keep it there in some shape or form. But at the same time, hopefully add more of a residential component or make it available that can happen or incentivize it in some way. Because as you know, it has been said before, the county is going to grow in some way. You know, multiple thousands of people will continue to come into the county. It may have slowed down somewhat recently, but you know, the county is going to grow, and this seems like one of the best areas to allow that to happen. And I think there's some advantages here that this isn't really a town center the way Rockville is. This isn't a town. This is just a stretch of land that just happens to have been developed over time. So in many regards, we don't really have historic structures here that I can think of, or you know, that historic aspect that we have to be aware of or take into account, unless I'm missing something. So it may be a little easier in some respects. We aren't going to come in and just bulldoze down some historic structures. But you know, if we can offer incentives in such a way to incentivize the folks that have property there now or other potential developers to continue with the commercial aspect at the same time, you know, add more residences close by that can then work near where they live. Anyway, I just wanted to say this was very helpful. And if we can learn from whatever Rockville did well and try to not do what they did badly, I think we'd be well served as we proceed forward. That was it.
Can I just add one more thing? One thing I can tell you too, in the development of that area for Rockville, it was one of the first areas that they were very interested in moving environmental concepts into. So both the council and the mayor at that time, you know, really, and they created an environment commission with the aim of hoping to, you know, give input and guidance, you know, to, you know, what was happening in that space. So,
All right. Good discussion, guys. I was hoping maybe we could discuss the different case studies and try to think about how they might apply to the study area, but I think we're going to have to hold off on that until the next meeting. Maybe kind of in the meantime, you know, think about it in your head. You know, what were the different case studies we reviewed and how they might be able to apply, what would be appropriate, what would be appropriate. But given that it's almost time to end the meeting, I wanted to at least give a chance for anyone who's listening in on public input to offer a comment. So anyone who's listening now, please, if you want to offer a comment, please hit *3 on your phone and enter the queue, and we'll hear what you have to say. This will take a moment. So here we go.
Hey, John, this is Eric Soder. Can you
Hey,
hear me?
Eric. Yep,
How you
you're coming through.
Okay,
Go
good. I
ahead.
just wanted to check this. I've been listening in. I just want to revisit the puppy discussion from the first 20 minutes. No, in all seriousness, it's good to see everybody, and Happy New Year. I'm glad we're kind of getting back around to kicking off this corridor plan. It's some interesting discussion, and I'll just make these comments, and we can all either talk offline or follow up at some point. And everybody's busy. I guess just with the later part of the discussion regarding Rockville, I think one thing is interesting to note is it's probably a city in which you can learn from what they did well, but also what they didn't do well, or what took some time for them to get moving. And one of those things, which, as you know, I have touched on, is the APFO. Their APFO, and one reason why it took so much time for redevelopment is their original APFO for schools in particular was more restrictive than the counties. And so it's interesting when I heard, we're going to do the case study on redevelopment for Rockville. It's not something that the development community necessarily sees as a beacon for redevelopment along this corridor. But certainly the APFO schools is something to learn from, because I think in like 2015 or 16, they had to go back to the drawing board and realize they at least need to be on par with the surrounding county, because they were just having the county and the city of Gaithersburg eat their lunch in terms of redevelopment opportunities. That's why Rio is there. That's why Crown Property is there in the city of Gaithersburg and elsewhere. So just an interesting note on that. I guess the other thing is, to keep it short, is just to understand the charrette process. And again, we can talk offline about that, is if there's going to be an opportunity for individual property owners, and maybe you're envisioning something at a very much larger vision scale than individual properties, but at some point it may be interesting to bring in individual property owners, and I represent some of those that have been working on some of these respective properties, and wouldn't be a great opportunity to share them with the group, because I'm not completely clear whether this is a group that is going to create this plan. This advisory group is the one that's setting this planning framework, and then that would be what somebody has to find conformance with as we move through the process. Good discussion, and just look forward to talking with you in the future.
Thanks, Eric.
All right.
Any questions for Eric?
Well, I just want to follow up real quickly with what he said. I think that's a good idea to bring in some of the property owners, because I'm involved in another group doing some things, and there's a land use attorney in that group, and it's not Noel. And he basically said the other day that he thinks this whole thing is fantasy, that he doesn't really envision the property owners in this area doing what we're envisioning to do. So that's his perspective, and but I think we need to take that into account. So what Eric was saying, I think, is very important that we remember that, and do bring in some of the property owners as we're creating this vision.
Yeah, and John, am I still on?
Yeah, go ahead.
So, I mean, one thing to think about is, particularly since we're in this virtual environment, I mean, we've used the Teams and the Zoom rooms before, where you can have 3 or 4 rooms set up, and maybe that is where you have, within a set hour, 3 or 4 of the property owners are sitting there waiting, and 4 or 5 of you, or a few of you, rotate in for 10 minutes, almost like speed dating, and we kind of present and get some feedback and get some whatever, and then it's like, okay, go to the next one. It's just, to Mark's point, I think there are a few of us. There's certainly a few property owners that have interest and have begun to do the due diligence and are looking at it. But there could be an interesting way that we, and I mean collectively, we engage with each other, sort of in a virtual time frame that works with everybody's schedule, and it doesn't have to be, a lengthy process, but set aside an hour of one of your times and kind of have this speed dating thing where you guys rotate a few of you in and out and get some feedback. Just a thought, and be happy to work with you on it in the future.
Okay. Thanks, Eric.
Yep.
All right. Any last thoughts, anybody? Kelly,
Does my mic work? Can you hear me?
you're quiet, but we can hear you.
Okay, I don't know what the problem is today. Yeah, to Eric's point, it's important not to talk about you without you. So we've got to think about who the stakeholders are in all of this. And I just wanted to say, Dennis, I grew up in Rockville and I watched my old hometown be destroyed, the building of the Rockville Mall, and I got my first pair of PF flyers at Chanticleer's and a pair of overalls from Curly's at Rockville Mall.
Wow, you're one of the 19 people who actually went there.
Yeah, that's about right.
I had my first paying job at Pizza Oven, which was one of the buildings that kind of just barely missed being subsumed by that mall.
Over by the Peoples?
Yeah.
Yep.
All
Yes,
right. Well, thank you.
It's old home days at the South Frederick.
I feel like this is an inside joke. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. I missed that. Sorry.
But I'm a cat person too.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody. And next meeting is scheduled for 2 weeks from now, same time, same place. And that'll be it. We'll be in touch. Goodbye. Hey, Dennis and Kim, would you mind sticking around?